The arrival of the human. The cold metal walls of the Zephyrian research facility hummed with energy. Bright blue lights flickered as scientists in silver uniforms gathered around a large containment pod. Inside the pod lay a creature they had only seen in history records, a human. Lyra, a young Zephyrian scientist, stood closest to the glass. Her deep blue eyes narrowed as she observed the unconscious figure inside. The creature was unlike anything she had ever seen before. His body was massive, covered in firm muscles. His skin was rough, not smooth like her kind. His chest rose and fell steadily, his breathing calm. She turned to her fellow scientists. "Are you sure this is a human? He looks different." One of the senior researchers, Valen, nodded. "Yes, the scans confirm it. A pure human male. No cybernetic parts. No genetic modifications, just raw biology." The others whispered among themselves. Humans were supposed to be weak, fragile, easy to break. But this one looked powerful. Lyra hesitated before pressing a button on the control panel. A mechanical arm moved above the pod, releasing a scanner that hovered over the human's body. As the scanner passed over his muscles, the readings spiked beyond normal levels. "This is impossible," another scientist whispered. "His muscle density is twice that of any known species." Lyra swallowed. Something about this human made her uneasy. Why would a primitive species have a body like this? The first shock. Just as she was about to take more readings, a sudden jolt ran through the room. The lights flickered, and the containment pod shook violently. Lyra stepped back. What's happening? The human's fingers twitched. Then his hand clenched into a fist. The Zephyrian scientists gasped in shock. "He's waking up," one of them shouted. The room fell silent as the human's eyes snapped open. A deep, piercing gaze met Lyra's. His eyes were a strange shade, darker than any Zephyrian's, filled with something ancient and powerful. For a moment, no one moved. Then the human sat up. His movements were slow but controlled, like a predator testing its surroundings. The Zephyrian scientists stumbled back, their confidence fading. Lyra felt her pulse race. She had seen many alien species before, but none had made her feel like this, like she was standing in front of something dangerous. Valen quickly grabbed a stun rod and stepped forward. "Restrain him," he ordered. The human's gaze flickered to the device, then back to Valen. He didn't look afraid. He looked amused. "Where am I?" The human spoke. His voice was deep, rough, and filled with authority. No one answered. The human glanced at the cold walls, the bright lights, and the group of trembling scientists. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging up the glass of the pod. Then he raised his arms and stretched, his muscles flexing. "I'll ask again," he said, his voice sharper now. "Where am I?" The failed restraint. Lyra forced herself to speak. "You are in Zephyrian space, a research facility." The human's head tilted slightly, as if considering her words. Then he moved. Fast, too fast. One moment, he was sitting. The next, he was standing on his feet inside the pod, his entire body towering over them. A scientist pressed a button, and electric restraints snapped around his arms and legs. The room relaxed. "That should hold him," Valen muttered. But then something terrifying happened. The human pulled his arms apart, and the restraints shattered like glass. A wave of silence fell over the room. The Zephyrians froze in fear. No species had ever broken out of those restraints. The human rolled his shoulders, stretching as if the restraints were never there. His eyes met Lyra's again, and this time he smiled. A slow, confident smile. "Nice try," he said. A shiver ran down Lyra's spine. The fear of the unknown. Panic spread. Scientists scrambled to grab weapons. Energy shields were activated. Alarms blared through the facility. But the human didn't run. He didn't panic. Instead, he stepped forward. The Zyphorians pointed their energy weapons at him. "Do not move," one of them shouted. The human stopped. His dark eyes studied them all, as if memorizing their faces. Then, slowly, he raised his hands in surrender. But Lyra knew. This wasn't surrender. This was a warning. And for the first time in her life, she realized something terrifying. They were not in control anymore. The human was. And he knew it. Awakening of the beast. The room was dead silent. The human stood in the center, his arms raised, his expression unreadable. The Zyphorian scientists held their weapons steady, but their hands trembled. Lyra could hear the rapid breathing of her colleagues, the frantic beeping of the containment pod's broken security systems. Valen, still gripping his stun rod, stepped forward. "Restrain him again," he ordered. The guards hesitated. Now, one of them pressed a button, and the walls around the containment pod shifted. Energy shackles shot out from hidden compartments, designed to latch onto the prisoner's wrists and ankles. The human didn't even flinch. He simply stood there as the restraints wrapped around him. The high-energy bonds glowed with a bright blue hue, their electromagnetic fields pulsing. These were the strongest containment tools the Zyphorians had, capable of holding creatures far more dangerous than any primitive species. Lyra let out a shaky breath. "It's over," she whispered. Then the human smirked. The impossible resistance. For a few seconds, he simply looked at his bindings. He tilted his head, testing their strength with slow, deliberate movements. Then he clenched his fists, and the entire facility felt the shift. The energy restraints shuddered. The scientists gasped as the energy fields flickered, struggling to contain the sheer force pressing against them. And then, snap! One by one, the restraints gave way. The metal clamps shattered. The energy fields sparked and fizzled out. And the human was free. Again. A deep, slow cracking sound echoed through the room. At first, Lyra thought it was the sound of the broken restraints. Then she realized. It was the sound of the floor beneath his feet, buckling under the pressure of his strength. He rolled his shoulders, stretched his neck, and exhaled. The Zyphorians were frozen. "No species resists our technology," Valen whispered, his voice shaking. The human looked at him, amusement dancing in his dark eyes. "Then maybe you don't know as much as you think." The scientist's fear. Lyra felt something she had never experienced before. Fear. Not fear of failure. Not fear of making a mistake. This was primal fear. The kind of fear creatures felt when they realized they were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. She had studied hundreds of species across the galaxy. Some had enhanced intelligence, others had powerful bodies, but none had ever combined both perfectly. This human was not just strong. He was in control. She could see it in his eyes, the sharp calculation, the silent assessment of his surroundings. He wasn't just reacting. He was planning. The attempt to contain. Valen's composure snapped. "Deploy the guards." The doors to the lab hissed open, and a squad of armored Zyphorian enforcers marched in. Their weapons were already charged, their orders clear. The human slowly turned toward them, his expression unreadable. Lyra felt a sickening realization. They had made a mistake. A terrible, horrible mistake. This wasn't a prisoner they were dealing with. This was a predator. The Zyphorian commander barked an order. Fire. A barrage of plasma bolts shot through the air. The human moved. Not ran. Not dodged. He simply shifted. A slight turn of the body. A step to the side. A duck just below the trajectory. Every single shot missed. The scientists stared in shock. The Zyphorian guards had perfect accuracy. Their weapons were designed to track movement. And yet, this human moved faster than their weapons could predict. Lyra's heart pounded. He's learning our attack patterns. The first attack. The human finally acted. With a single explosive movement, he lunged forward. The nearest guard didn't even have time to react before a massive hand grabbed his weapon. The human crushed it. The energy rifle, a highly advanced piece of Xiphorian technology, crumpled like paper in his grip. The guard tried to back away, but the human's other hand shot out, grabbing him by the armor. With a flick of his wrist, he threw the guard across the room. The others hesitated. That was their mistake. The human tore through them. No weapons, no enhancements, just pure physical strength. He grabbed one by the arm and twisted. The sound of breaking bone echoed through the chamber. He kicked another, sending him flying into a control panel. Sparks erupted as the system overloaded. One of the guards tried to retreat, but the human caught him, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. The guard screamed. Then the human did something strange. He set him down. The last standing guard stumbled backward, trembling. The human stared at him for a long moment, then turned his back, as if he wasn't even worth his time. That was worse than any attack. That was humiliation. A monster in human skin. The lad was in ruins. The guards lay unconscious, groaning in pain. The scientists, too shocked to move. The human turned back toward them, his face calm, his body still relaxed. "You people have the wrong idea," he finally said. "You think humans are weak." He took a step forward, and the scientists flinched. "But here's the truth." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but filled with something dangerous. "Humans were born on a planet where everything tries to kill us." He pointed to the shattered restraints. "Your technology doesn't scare me." Then he gestured to the unconscious guards. "Your weapons don't stop me." Finally, he leaned down slightly, meeting Lyra's wide, fearful eyes. "So tell me, what do you have left?" Lyra couldn't answer, because for the first time in her life, she realized the terrifying truth. The galaxy had underestimated humanity. And now, it was too late. The experiment turns into a hunt. The control room was in chaos. The alarm screamed, red lights flashing across the metallic walls. Emergency lockdown protocols engaged, sealing the facility. The remaining Xiphorian scientists scrambled behind reinforced barriers, their wide, fearful eyes fixed on the human, the thing that had shattered their expectations. Lyra's breathing was ragged. She could still hear the echoes of bones breaking, the crash of bodies hitting steel, and the effortless way he had dismantled their elite security. The human was not running. He stood tall in the ruined containment chamber, his gaze sweeping the room like a predator studying prey. Then he did something terrifying. He smiled. A slow, knowing grin spread across his face, as if this was all a game to him. And the Xiphorians had already lost. Desperate orders. "Seal every exit. Don't let him escape," Valen shouted, his voice breaking. Security personnel rushed to obey. Heavy containment doors slammed shut, thick barriers designed to hold war beasts from hostile planets. Plasma cannons emerged from the walls, their targeting systems locking onto the human. Lyra's hands shook as she typed into her datapad, sending an emergency distress call to the Xiphorian High Command. The response came almost instantly. Directive received. Eliminate the specimen immediately. She swallowed hard. Eliminate. They wanted to kill him. She looked at the human again. He hadn't moved. His muscles were relaxed, his breathing steady. But she knew. This was not a man who was afraid. This was a man who was waiting. For them to make a mistake. For them to attack first. The first shot. Valen raised his hand. Fire. The plasma cannons unleashed hell. A dozen energy blasts lit up the room, streaks of burning light racing toward the human. The force was enough to disintegrate most species on impact. Lyra braced for the end. But when the light faded, the human was still standing. Untouched. Alive. No, that's impossible. One of the scientists gasped. Smoke rose from the human's body. His shirt was scorched, revealing hard, scarred muscle beneath. But he was unharmed. He looked down at his bare chest, brushing away the remaining sparks. Then he chuckled. The sound sent chills through Lyra's spine. "That tickled," he muttered. "The hunt begins." The room exploded into panic. Valen stumbled backward. "Increase the power. All cannons. Maximum charge." Lyra grabbed his arm. "Stop. It's not working." But Valen wasn't listening. He was terrified, just like everyone else. Lyra turned back to the human, but he was gone. Her heart stopped. The security personnel froze in horror. The human had been standing in the open. He should have been visible. And yet, somehow, he had disappeared. A cold realization settled in. They had been studying him. But all this time, he had been studying them. And now, the experiment was over. Now he was the hunter. Vanishing in plain sight, the soldiers turned wildly, scanning every shadow, every dark corner of the lab. "Where is he?" one of them whispered. Lyra tapped on her wrist device, switching the room's thermal scanners to full sensitivity. The screen flickered to life. Nothing. No heat signature. No movement. Nothing. Her blood ran cold. "That's not possible," she whispered. "He has body heat. He should be visible." And then a voice. "You rely too much on your technology." The sound came from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the air itself. The scientists spun in all directions, their fear turning into full-blown panic. Lyra's heart pounded. The human wasn't just strong. He was smart. He had figured out how their scanners worked. And now, he was using their own systems against them. The attack from the shadows. The scream erupted. One of the soldiers vanished, dragged into the darkness with an unnatural speed. Another tried to run, but a hand shot out of nowhere, grabbing him by the throat and slamming him into a steel wall. A third turned to fire his weapon, but the human was already behind him. Lyra barely had time to process what was happening before bodies started dropping. A figure blurred through the shadows, moving faster than the eye could track. The guards' weapons fired wildly, missing every shot. The scientists scrambled for cover. It was no longer a fight. It was a slaughter, a moment of terror. Lyra crouched behind a console, her breath shallow. Her mind raced through every possible scenario. They were trapped. The human was faster, stronger, smarter, and he was angry. The lights flickered. The facility's power grid was failing. The human was taking them apart one by one. Lyra clutched her datapad, her fingers shaking. Then she heard a soft sound behind her. Breathing. Deep. Slow. Controlled. He was right behind her. She turned too late. A hand clamped gently around her wrist. Not crushing. Not harming. Just holding her in place. Her entire body went still. Slowly, she looked up and met his eyes. Dark. Unreadable. But not cruel. Not mindless. For the first time, Lyra saw something other than violence in them. She saw restraint. The human could have snapped her bones in an instant, but he didn't. Why? Her voice came out as a whisper. "What do you want?" The human exhaled. Then, in a voice filled with quiet amusement, he answered. A conversation. The trap and the unexpected. The entire facility stood still. The alarms still screamed. Red lights flashed across metallic walls. The air smelled of burning plasma and fear. Yet, in the center of it all, Lyra stood frozen, her wrist caught in the grip of the human. He hadn't hurt her. He could have snapped her bones, crushed her throat, or thrown her across the room like the others. But he didn't. Instead, he simply held her, firm, unshakable. His dark eyes locked onto hers, studying her just as she had once studied him. And then, in the quietest, most unsettling voice, he repeated, "I just want to talk." Negotiating with a predator. Lyra's throat was dry. The human had already torn through their security forces, dodged plasma fire, and moved through the facility like a shadow. He was a living weapon, a predator wrapped in unbreakable flesh. And yet, he was talking. Her mind screamed, "Don't engage." But her instincts whispered, "Listen." Swallowing her fear, she forced her voice to steady. "You killed my people." The human raised an eyebrow. "Killed," he repeated. Then, with a smirk, he tilted his head toward the fallen guards. They were all breathing. Groaning in pain, yes, but alive. Her stomach twisted. He had been holding back. He could have ended them. But he didn't. Why? She met his eyes again, searching for something, anything, that made sense. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The human released her wrist and took a step back. "Answers." The Zyphorian trap. Before Lyra could speak, a metallic clank echoed through the chamber. Her eyes widened in horror. They had activated the trap. Thick, reinforced blast doors slammed down around them, cutting off all exits. A containment field flared to life, one powerful enough to restrain war machines. In the control center, Valen's voice crackled through the intercom. "We have him. Flood the chamber with paralysis gas." Lyra turned just in time to see hissing nozzles activate, releasing a dense green mist into the air. Her heart sank. They weren't listening. They were still treating him like an animal. She turned back to the human. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "You people just don't learn." Then he moved. The escape nobody expected. The moment the gas touched the air, the human took a deep breath, then held it. Lyra knew the Zyphorian gas would shut down the nervous system of any living creature in seconds. Even enhanced warriors collapsed within moments. But the human just stood there, waiting, observing. And then he moved toward the walls, toward the containment field itself. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. "No, that's impossible. No species could touch a raw energy field without vaporizing." The human reached out. A scientist screamed. The field crackled. Blue arcs of electricity surged around his fingers. And then he walked through it, shattering the impossible. A surge of energy ripped through the room, blinding everyone for a second. When the light faded, the human was on the other side of the field, completely unharmed. Lyra's mind collapsed into chaos. How? How had he? The gas. She turned, realizing that the human hadn't been breathing since it was released. He had held his breath the entire time, letting the Zyphorians think their weapon was working. He had been playing along. A trap, and they had walked right into it. The warning. Valen's panicked voice crackled through the intercom. "Impossible. Nothing can survive." The human turned toward the control center's cameras. His gaze burned through the screens. And then he spoke. "If your species ever sets foot on Earth." His voice was calm, steady, but every word felt like a promise. "You won't survive the first day." Silence. Then, the entire facility shook. Explosions erupted through the upper floors. Power systems overloaded. Emergency lights flickered and died. He had disabled their entire station. And now he was leaving. Lyra, her chest tight, her mind struggling to process everything, felt a deep, terrifying realization settle over her. The Zyphorian Empire had made a terrible mistake. They thought humans were weak. But they had just witnessed the truth. Truth about humanity. The entire facility trembled. Flickering emergency lights barely illuminated the wreckage. Smoke curled through the air. Sparks rained from damaged panels. The Zyphorian Research Station, a structure meant to withstand planetary invasions, was collapsing from within. And at the center of it all stood the human. Untouched, unbothered, unstoppable. Lyra pressed her back against the control panel, her breath coming in short gasps. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears. The others, scientists, soldiers, even the high-ranking officers, were all frozen in fear. Because they all knew the truth now. This wasn't just some primitive creature. This was a monster wrapped in human skin, and they had caged it, tested it, underestimated it. Now, they were paying the price. The humans' escape. Valen's panicked voice broke through the silence. Lock down the station. We cannot let him leave. Lyra knew it was useless. The security grid was failing. The weapons systems were disabled. The guards were either unconscious or too terrified to fight. And the human. He was already moving. With a single powerful leap, he reached the exit doors, sealed with the strongest Zephyrian alloys known to exist. He placed his hands on the metal, took a deep breath, and pushed. The doors screamed under the pressure. Lyra couldn't look away. She had seen entire battleships struggle against these reinforced barriers. They could withstand missile fire, gravity shifts, even orbital bombardments. And yet, the metal bent beneath his fingers. With a sound like thunder, the doors ripped open. Not from explosives, not from weapons, from sheer brute strength. The human stepped through, and the alarms flared louder than ever before. Warning. Breach detected. Breach detected. A shudder passed through the Zephyrian scientists. They had created these warnings for external threats, for when the Empire was under attack. But now, the threat was not outside. The threat had been inside the whole time, and it was walking free. Lyra's last chance. Before anyone could stop her, Lyra acted on instinct. She rushed forward. "Wait," she shouted. The human paused. The others gasped, as if she had spoken directly to a storm or reached out to touch a wildfire. But the human turned toward her, his expression calm, curious. Lyra swallowed hard. You asked for answers," she stammered, "about what we know of your kind. Let me tell you." The silence stretched. Then, the human smirked. "I already know the answer." Lyra frowned. "What?" He gestured around at the wreckage, at the terrified Zephyrians, at the broken doors. "This." He waved a hand. "This tells me everything I need to know." She didn't understand. "What do you mean?" The human's expression darkened. "Your people think you're the top of the food chain, that you're superior, that you can experiment on others like animals." His voice dropped lower. "But you don't understand what real predators look like." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Predators. She had studied thousands of species. She had examined warrior races, mercenary clans, apex hunters of hostile worlds. Yet never, in her entire life, had she considered that humans, the species they had dismissed as weak, could be the real threat, the true apex predators of the galaxy. The warning. The human stepped closer, not rushing, not threatening, just walking. Yet every Zephyrian in the room flinched as if death itself was approaching. When he reached Lyra, he stopped, looking down at her. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "You will never understand what it means to be human." Lyra swallowed. "Then tell me." The human tilted his head, as if considering her request. Then, without breaking eye contact, he said, "We are not the strongest. We are not the fastest. We don't have natural weapons, armored skin, or psychic abilities." He leaned in slightly. "But we have something your kind will never have." Lyra barely dared to breathe. "What?" The human's eyes flashed. "We adapt." His words crashed into her like a shockwave. "You created this station to study me. But in the time you spent watching me, I was watching you. I learned your systems. I learned your weapons. And now, I'm walking out of here." Lyra realized, too late, that he had never been a prisoner. He had been a student, and the Zephyrians had just taught him how to win. The escape. The human took one last look at the terrified faces around him. Then he turned away. The scientists made no move to stop him. The soldiers stayed on the ground. Even Valen, once so confident in their superiority, said nothing. Because deep down, they all knew the truth now. There was no stopping him. Lyra watched as the human stepped through the shattered blast doors, disappearing into the darkness of the facility's lower corridors. She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. And in that moment, she knew the Xiphorian Empire would never be the same again. Because they had poked a sleeping giant, and the giant had woken up. The warning. The station lay in ruins. Fires flickered in shattered corridors. Sirens wailed through the broken infrastructure. The once proud Xiphorian research facility now stood as a graveyard of arrogance. And the human, the anomaly they had captured, tested, and mocked, was gone. Lyra stood in the control room, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The metallic tang of plasma fire filled the air. Around her, the remaining scientists and officers struggled to process what had just happened. Their greatest mistake had just walked out the door. And nobody had stopped him. Nobody could. A chill ran through her bones. The Xiphorian Empire had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. Because this wasn't just a prisoner escaping. This was a declaration of war. The Empire's reaction. A holographic communicator flickered to life in the center of the control chamber. Lyra turned, recognizing the towering figure that appeared in shimmering blue light. High Commander Dazik, leader of the Xiphorian military. His silver eyes burned with anger as he scanned the destroyed lab. Report. Valen, still struggling to find his composure, staggered forward. The specimen, the human, has escaped. A sharp silence followed. Dazik's expression did not change. His gaze was cold, calculating. Then retrieve him. Valen flinched. Till we can't. Lyra swallowed hard. Sir, you don't understand. Dazik cut her off. I understand perfectly. You have failed. His eyes darkened. A single unarmed creature walked into a Xiphorian stronghold and walked out again. And you call that a specimen? Lyra's throat tightened. It wasn't just a failure. It was an embarrassment, a wound to the Empire's pride that could never be erased. And the High Commander would not tolerate it. The hunt begins. Dazik turned to one of his officers outside the holographic projection. Send the Shadow Corps. I want that thing found and executed. Lyra's breath caught. The Shadow Corps. The deadliest force in the Xiphorian military. They weren't just soldiers. They were assassins, trained to hunt and eliminate anything considered a threat to the Empire. And now, they were going after the human. Lyra took a step forward. Sir, wait. Dazik's gaze snapped to her. A warning. A command. Do not question me, scientist. His voice was like steel. The Empire does not tolerate defiance. Lyra clenched her fists. He doesn't understand. Nobody does. They still think this is a standard retrieval mission. They still think this human is just another anomaly to be erased. They don't understand that he let them live, that he chose to walk away, that he is more dangerous than anything they've ever faced before. The Shadow Corps arrives. Hours later, the Xiphorian Shadow Corps deployed. Sleek, black warships ripped through the void, heading straight for the outer edges of the facility's planetary sector. Their orders were clear. Find the human, kill the human, erase the failure. Lyra stood in the observation bay, watching the warships vanish into the stars. She had seen the Shadow Corps wage war against entire civilizations. She had seen them burn planets to dust for lesser offenses. And yet, for the first time in her life, she felt pity for them, because they didn't know. They didn't know what they were walking into. Elsewhere, in the silence of space, the human drifted through the void, silent and unseen. He had stolen a Xiphorian escape pod, overriding its navigation system within minutes. The vessel was fast, compact, and designed for stealth, perfect for avoiding long-range sensors. He gazed out at the infinite darkness of space, his mind running through the past hours. The Xiphorians thought they had captured a specimen. They had no idea what they had really done. They had just alerted the most dangerous species in the galaxy to their existence. Humans had been underestimated before. By beasts, by nature, by war. But there was one truth no species in the universe had ever learned and lived to tell. You do not provoke humanity. Because when humans are pushed, they push back. The first mistake. Minutes later, an alarm pinged on his stolen Zyphorian console. The Shadow Corv was moving, hunting him. The human exhaled, shaking his head with quiet amusement. You just don't learn, do you? With a few quick keystrokes, he accessed the Zyphorian encrypted military channels. Their security was impressive, but not impressive enough. Within seconds, he had hacked into their fleet communications. Their plans, their formations, their weaknesses. He smiled. The Zyphorians thought they were hunting him. They didn't realize they were already in his trap. The warning they ignored. Lyra stood alone in the observation deck, her eyes locked on the distant stars. A cold feeling coiled in her gut. She had tried to warn them. She had tried to make them listen. But the Empire was too arrogant, too blind. And so, history was about to be written in blood. Because somewhere, out there in the black void of space, a human was waiting. Not hiding. Not running. Waiting. And the Zyphorian Shadow Corv was heading straight into his hands. The legend begins. The Zyphorian Shadow Corvs had never lost a hunt. Their warships cut through the void like obsidian blades, silent, deadly, and unrelenting. Hundreds of Zyphorian elite warriors sat in their drop pods, gripping plasma rifles, their armor gleaming under the dim red interior lights. The mission was simple. Find the escaped human. Terminate the threat. Leave no trace. Commander Varric, the leader of the fleet, stood at the warship's command deck, arms folded behind his back. His cold silver eyes scanned the data feeds, tracking the human's last known trajectory. This was routine. The human was alone. No weapons, no fleet, no allies. One target, one hunt, one kill. Varric allowed himself a small smirk. This will be over in minutes. He had no idea he was leading his men into a graveyard. The ambush. At the outer rim of the system, the human watched them arrive. He had been drifting in the stolen Zyphorian escape pod, using its low energy profile to remain undetectable. But now it was time to act. He activated the ship's console, his fingers flying across the alien interface. Within seconds, he had bypassed Zyphorian security protocols and overridden their fleet's navigation data. And then, with a small, knowing grin, he sent out a false distress signal. A single message. Human anomaly detected. Target locked. Then he waited, like a wolf watching a pack of blind hunters stumble into his den. The trap is sprung. On the Zyphorian flagship, Commander Varric's console flashed red. We have him, an officer barked. A distress beacon from a damaged escape pod. He's stranded near the asteroid field on Grid 17. Varric smiled. Prepare the drop squads. We end this now. The fleet changed course, their massive warships shifting toward the asteroid cluster where the signal had been transmitted. They were confident, arrogant, ready for an easy kill. They never questioned why a human, an intelligent, adaptable predator, would send out a distress beacon. They never stopped to think that the hunt had been flipped. The first kill. The Zyphorian warships entered the asteroid field, engines roaring as they closed in on their target. The first dropships detached, carrying squads of elite Shadow Corps warriors. Their orders were clear: eliminate the human and retrieve his body. Their ships landed on a massive asteroid, their boots crunching against the dust and ice. The soldiers fanned out in formation, rifles aimed at the wreckage of the escape pod in the distance. The pod's hatch was open. The human was gone. A creeping sense of unease spread through the Zyphorian ranks. Then, a shadow moved. One of the soldiers barely had time to react before a hand shot out from the darkness, grabbing him by the neck. A sickening crack echoed through the asteroid. The other soldiers spun, weapons raised. But they saw nothing. Only the darkness. Only the silence. Then, another scream. Another body dragged into the abyss. Then another. Then another. One by one, the hunters vanished into the void. They had come for a simple mission. But now, they were prey. The fear sets in. On the command deck, Varric's smirk faded. "Status report," he barked. Static. The soldiers had gone dark. Impossible. Where is the target? More static. Then, a single voice came through. He's not a target. He's a monster." Gunfire erupted through the transmission. Screams. A sickening crunch. Then, silence. Varric felt a rare chill crawl up his spine. One man versus an army. Inside the asteroid field, the last surviving Shadow Corps soldier ran. He had seen things that defied reason. His comrades, trained killers, each one a seasoned warrior, were gone. Not shot. Not vaporized. Gone. And the human? He hadn't used a single weapon. No blades, no plasma rifles. Only his hands. His mind. And the fear he had planted in them. The soldier gasped for breath. His helmet visor cracked, his plasma rifle shaking in his grip. He turned a corner, eyes darting around for an escape route, and ran straight into him. The human. Tall. Still. Calm. His face partially hidden in the shadows, his gaze unreadable. The Zyphorian froze. Please," the soldier whispered. "Don't." The human didn't move. For a long moment, the two simply stared at each other. Then, the human spoke. "Tell them." The soldier swallowed hard. Tell them what?" The human stepped closer. "Tell your empire what happens when you hunt us." And then, he let him go. The soldier didn't hesitate. He turned and ran for his life. Because he understood. The human wasn't just surviving. He was sending a message. The final warning. Hours later, the single surviving soldier stumbled back onto the flagship, shaking, pale, barely able to stand. Varric stared at him, eyes burning with fury. "Where is your squad?" The soldier couldn't even look at him. Gone. Varric's hands clenched into fists. And the human? The soldier swallowed. His voice trembled. "He let me live." Silence. Varric felt his fury shift into something far worse. For the first time in his life, he felt fear. Because the human had done something no enemy had ever done before. He didn't just escape. He didn't just kill. He made sure they remembered. And in that moment, Varric understood the truth about humanity. You don't conquer them. You don't hunt them. Because when you push humans to the edge, they don't break. They evolve. And they come back. Epilogue. The legend begins. Across the Zyphorian Empire, whispers began to spread. The Shadow Court had failed. The human had survived. A single warrior, alone, without weapons, without armor, had outwitted, outmaneuvered, and destroyed the most elite force in the galaxy. And he was still out there. Some call him a myth. Others called him a monster. But those who had seen what happened, they knew the truth. A new legend had been born. And the galaxy would never be the same again.